Hi, everybody. It's us. I feel if we keep introducing ourselves every time, we will be like Larry, Daryl, and they probably should have at some point walked in to the show and just said, "Hi, it's us," but they never did. So it's also, I'm doing that because this is take 3 of this rather short episode. The first one was vetoed because we spent too much time talking about the human anatomy. We couldn't get Adam's right arm straight from his left arm. And the second one, I botched the screen share. So that is now done. So we are on take 3 right now. Takes 1 and 2 are available for a small fee on demand. I will tell you where they can be posted. They will cost 99 cents each or $1.50 for both. So this is a very special episode. We are returning to our tweets of the week, or tweet of the week. In this case, we have 3 tweets. We haven't done these in a while, but there were 3 rather remarkable tweets in a very short period of time. So we decided, what the hell, let's group them and say something. Because for each one, we had said, hey, we should tweet it. We should post about this. We should speak about this. So I figured, let's do them all. Adam figured, let's do them all at once. You'll recognize a couple of the names if you've been watching our episodes or if you're in academia. We've definitely talked about 2 of them in the past. One of them is Dov Waxman, who's going to begin our little show here. And I'm going to turn on screen share now, and hopefully it's going to work properly this time. Dov Waxman. Okay, now just to remind everyone who he is a UCLA professor. We have discussed some of his tweets on our show before, and Judea Pearl spoke about him in that great episode. If you have not watched our episode with Judea Pearl, it's wonderful. He's, aside from the fact that he's a brilliant computer scientist, he really gave us the inside scoop on the problem at UCLA with anti-Semitism, including the Jewish Studies program. So Dov Waxman is in that. Now, as I said in the previous cut, and I'm sorry that got lost, that I said that I don't really follow Dov Waxman that much because I find his views rather pedestrian, and he tweets a lot. But this one happened to be retweeted by Sasha the Twerp, so I managed to see it. And
you don't find Sasha pedestrian?
Well, of course he's pedestrian. I mean, he's one of the most simplistic people I've ever encountered. But
you follow him, but you don't follow Dov Waxman.
No, Sasha's very entertaining, and he's been remarkably entertaining this week because he's flipped out over Gay resigning from Harvard. Yeah, that's not sitting well with him.
Yeah.
So that's been very entertaining. So the Dov Waxman tweet, that said, is an important one. It's part of a long thread, and screw the thread. This one captures the essence of the problem that we see, and we need to discuss it for a bit. So it begins with the word "this," referring back to something we was discussing before that's not germane to this tweet. This illustrates an important difference in how many Jews and many Palestinians understand Zionism and anti-Zionism, which I could also argue is a false dichotomy, but let's not go there. Jews, for understandable reasons, tend to think of Zionism as a principle, namely that Jews have a right to national self-determination in their ancestral homeland. Palestinians, for understandable reasons, tend to think of Zionism as a practice. Key point, I will stop here for a second as I tell my students, keep the word practice in mind, how it has actually been implemented and what it has entailed for Palestinians. Many Jews therefore view anti-Zionism as a rejection of a Jewish right to self-determination, which they regard as discriminatory. Many Palestinians and their allies, i.e. people on the left in this country, by contrast, view anti-Zionism as opposition to the historical and current practices of Zionism. They oppose Zionism not because it is a Jewish national movement, but because it has resulted in Palestinian dispossession and the denial of Palestinian rights. These different understandings shape the current debate over whether anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. Now, upon rereading this, I think there's at least a half a dozen problems with it, and I will let you start, Adam, but I want to get one, just put this on the table right here. Let's assume for a minute that whatever the objective reality may be, and this would be a very contentious subject, which I'm not getting into right now, let's assume for a minute that Palestinians understand the presence of Jews in their land as dispossession and the denial of Palestinian rights. And there's no reason not to think that a Palestinian sitting in a refugee camp or a Palestinian observing settlements being built in the West Bank. There's no reason not to think that's what he believes. It would be a perfectly logical assumption on their part, right? So, Palestinians don't study history necessarily, every vast detail of the conflict. They're getting, a biased interpretation. And there's enough of a grain of truth in that where, you can't be surprised that this is how they feel.
Well, there are two grains of truth to what Dov Waxman is saying here. The first grain of truth, I think, is that it is, of course, valuable to look at how Jews and Palestinians define Zionism in different ways. I think that that is accurate. I don't think that Dov Waxman is necessarily hitting on how that difference is present in the mutual differences in definition. But I think it is nevertheless useful and helpful academically to understand this conflict by looking at how they define the term differently. So I think there's that grain of truth. And the other grain of truth is that, of course, if, say, Jewish nationalism was taking place somewhere else in the world, like, say, I don't know, an island off the coast of New Zealand somewhere, I don't think that the Palestinians would be all that concerned about Zionism or care.
I would argue that the American left would be, but that's they would invent Palestinians, as I argued in an op-ed that I wrote.
Well, okay, fair enough. Yeah, but the Palestinians that we know of would probably not be concerned about the fact that this is happening in their own backyard, and the fact that they have had to lose quite a bit so that the Jews can have their state is, I think, worth thinking about, right? So
absolutely. There's one thing that he's missing, though, even from this broad framework, right, which really needs to be in there. That, first of all, any two ethno-national communities that claim the same territory. And he's talking about Palestinians here, not Arabs writ large. So let's confine it to Palestinians for a minute here. Serbians versus Bosnians, Bosnian Muslims, for instance. One sees their movement as national self-determination. The Bosnians will see their movement as ethno-national self-determination. The Serbians will believe that they have been colonized. And they will say 1389, we lost the war to the Turks. That's why there's Muslims here. Conversely, the Serbians will, in exercising national self-determination, the Bosnians will say, these people are colonizing us. And they did so at the Yugoslavian state. So this whole, if one side sees it as nationalism and the other side sees it as imperialism, there's nothing, remarkable here. This is how ethno-national conflicts work. The other problem, though, is the fact, and he really needs to mention it, that what they're doing in opposing Zionism because it's colonialism is, in actuality, practicing their own nationalism. These people are Palestinian nationalists. They want a Palestinian ethno-national state, right? They're not just saying imperialism is bad, all people shall be free across the world. Yeah, obviously there's some people in the American left say that.
With that, of course, if he's right, and I think there might be a small grain of truth to it, like I said before, that the Palestinians do define Zionism that way. That Zionism for them means colonialism, it means imperialism. For Jews, Palestinian nationalism means terrorism. It means all of these other kinds of things that are threats to their way of life.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's 100% correct. Yeah, and again, you can look at other ethnic conflicts, the British and the Irish, perfect example if you want to bring terrorism into it, right? Yeah, so every nationalism thinks they've been colonized by someone else. And the flip side is those being accused of or those accusing the other of colonialism are in fact practicing nationalism. And this is 9 times out of 10 with ethno-national conflicts that take place. So that wider issue is very important to take into account. And Dov really shouldn't be leaving that out. But in any case, the stuff that is there, absolutely there's a grain of truth there, right? There's just a lack of recognition of some other factors here. Now, there is still a problem, right, with his opposition of ideology versus practice, right? I mean,
well, the term Zionism or any nationalism is both an idea and a practice. right? And he's focusing on Zionism for the Jews as just being an idea, and for the Palestinians, it's only a practice. But I think that we could that there is in fact an idea of Zionism that Palestinians have without regarding practice, and there's a practice of Zionism for Jews that has very little to do with the idea, or is disconnected, I should say, from the idea. So I think for both the Palestinians and the Jews, Zionism means a theory and a practice. It's just that Dov Waxman seems to want to only highlight how Jews understand it as only a theory, and the Palestinians only want to understand it as a practice. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, and Doug Waxman needs to be faulted for being a political scientist for not having seen.
Look, he should know, if he's a Jewish studies scholar, that Zionism had many different practical varieties,
Yeah,
and still
absolutely.
does, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
but I mean, even Herzl, I mean, even he had this naive view that the Arabs would be thrilled that the Jews were coming. So that is actually a European Enlightenment. I wouldn't necessarily say colonialist model, but it is this flawed view that Europeans had of themselves as being better, and the other people coming would want to actually.
but there were all kinds of different varieties, different variants of Zionism.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There still are, although far fewer of them now than there used to be.
Yeah.
And there was a form of Zionism that wanted to incorporate some kind of power sharing system with the regional Arabs at that time. Um,
Well, those putting that forth, Martin Buber, and in the United States, Judah Magnus, and perhaps Brandeis. I have to check my notes on that. You know, a lot of anti-Zionists, Shaul Magid says this all the time. Buber would be considered an anti-Zionist today, and he's actually right. He would be, because the binational state, which Peter Beinart, I mean, he's very ambiguous, but what he says can be interpreted as saying two ethno-national autonomous entities that might be grounded in territory or might be grounded in the individual, like the Bund's idea was with the Jews and the other nations around there would exist. That's essentially what Martin Buber and others were saying. They wouldn't be considered Zionists today. That's true.
somebody would be if they were around today, right? I
No,
mean,
of course. Okay, sorry. If someone propagating those ideas today,
okay,
and there are people propagating those ideas and they're considered anti-Zionists. Here's
right.
the issue. Now, and I don't fault him for this because he's a political scientist, but I do fault him because he's in Jewish studies. Is, the upshot of this, he doesn't actually come out right and say it, but he seems to be implying that in practice, even though he uses the word practice here, there is not actually a problem. There's just two people who see things a different way, and therefore it could potentially be worked out, right? They just need to understand the differing views on it. Now, here's where we get history into it being important. Now, from the Palestinian perspective, okay, since they view the practice of Zionism as being imperialism, when does this begin for them? There needs to be a starting date for when the Palestinians see the practice of Zionism to be bad. The Arabs in Palestine. When does it begin? And this is the big problem. If this were to begin in 1967, when, I haven't had a very tough time arguing with somebody why the settlements aren't a form of.
Know that it began much earlier than
Yeah,
that.
I know that. But see, here's a lot of people, the two-staters and all that, a two-stater like me, I'm never going to go right and accuse Israel publicly of colonialism, for building settlements. But I'd have a hard time arguing against someone, arguing that the settlement construction in the West Bank, which is contested territory, is not settlements being constructed by states isn't a form of colonialism. But pre-1967, okay, if Waxman somehow meant 67 here, then great, two peoples can sit together and understand their other views. But if this is in fact what the Palestinians believe, it didn't begin in 1967, right? It began much earlier. It certainly began in 1948, and it definitely, I would say it began probably the 1920s or 30s. I don't think in the first Aliyah era, I don't think they really thought about Zionism at all because there wasn't
They had the Arab riots in the 20s.
Yeah.
And that's when Palestinian nationalism was born.
Yeah. But even if you want to argue that there was some form of, hey, these are foreigners coming here before World War I, I don't think they were numerically significant enough to really affect the landscape. We're talking about a very small number of Jews on the eve of World War I. Yes, specialists studying the Ottoman era will find Palestinians who are angry. There's always a document showing that, but I would say on the whole, most of them didn't really notice this. So at the very least, his claim of how the Palestinians, or the Arabs of Palestine, as they might have been known in that time, viewed Zionism, viewed the practice of Zionism, goes back at least to the 1920s. So if that's correct, and if we need to accept that view as legitimate, then what is the fate of the land between the river and the sea? If everything Zionism has done as practice is imperialism and colonialism from the perspective of the colonized.
I'm not clear though what your point was before, when you were saying that as a political scientist, he thinks that if the two sides just understand one another's perspective on Zionism, they
Well,
could.
that has nothing to do with him being a political scientist. That has more with him being an idiot. But I could say some things about a political scientist.
I don't quite understand what you were getting at, though.
I'm getting at is that if, let's say, liberal Zionists like myself will argue, and I've written about it plenty, that what happened in 1948 and earlier, and till 67, since the Jews stayed within their borders, was not colonialism. I will argue that that is not imperialism or colonialism, even if the Palestinians perceived it as such. I would have to agree to a certain extent that post-67 settlement building is a form of colonialism. It's more complicated than that, yes, but fine. There is you got your grain of truth with the perspective of the practice of Zionism. But he seems to be suggesting that something can be worked out here. And if the Palestinians perceive everything that happened from the formation of the state of Israel and earlier, if that's what they mean by the practice of Zionism, then the only solution that they would be satisfied with would be the liquidation of Israel. They're not going to come around and say, okay, you're right, we've been colonized, but let's live happily ever after. Yeah, it's impossible, right? So,
well, he obviously doesn't know anything about conflict resolution.
And he's a political scientist, so that he should also know about ethnic conflicts, which I talked about 5 minutes ago. He as a political scientist, he should have studied comparative ethnic politics, as I did in my undergraduate poli-sci classes. I understand this shit. Yeah. So there's a real problem here, and there's a disconnect in the way he's interpreting this disconnect. Yeah. No, it's a real issue here. And I also suggest that there's a false dichotomy here between Zionism and anti-Zionism. You have to define your terms. There are people who are non-Zionists running around. It's very simplistic on the whole. And he gives no solution to it. Maybe he does in a later tweet, so I can't say that. So I also don't see what it has to do with whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism or not.
I don't know. Is he implying that?
It's the last sentence. These different understandings shape the current debate over whether anti-Zionism is or is not anti-Semitic. That's what I'm interpreting it. He's saying when you take these two, you have to take these two perspectives into account. And, the Palestinians and their allies, he also refers to their allies in this country, and that's key.
I understand what he's saying, right? For him, he's saying that Jews think that Palestinians are anti-Zionist because they are anti-Semitic, that they don't want the Jews there, right? That they have a fundamental problem with the idea of Jewish nationalism. And so what Waxman is saying is that if we were to understand that instead, that's not what the Palestinian problem is with Zionism and why they're anti-Zionists, then we would see that it has nothing to do with hating Jews, that they're not anti-Semitic, that in fact they're just more concerned about how Zionism has affected them.
Well, I got two responses. One, Hamas charter, but people will throw in buts and howevers for that. And two, The idea that the fact, sorry, that they refer to Israelis as Yahud. They use the same word that they use for Jew to refer to Israelis. I mean, they're labeling much larger category than the residents of Israel. They're saying this is a global thing. It's also a common belief among Palestinians, and Arafat's, stated it multiple times. I think it was even in the PLO's first 1964 constitution, or whatever you want to call that document, that the Jews are just a religious community, that they are not an ethnicity or a nation. That's a great way to undermine any ethno-national movement. You say you're not really a nation. Hey, you guys are just a religious group. And yeah, the Reform movement in 1881 would have agreed with that. Moses Mendelssohn would have agreed with that. But today, that, in my mind, that is an anti-Semitic belief, right? I mean,
but Waxman and others, many others, would say that this anti-Semitism came about as a result of Zionists doing these terrible things to Palestinians.
Can't I argue that late 19th century anti-Semitism in Europe was a product of the Jews disproportionately succeeding in the banking industry, as lawyers, as doctors, as everything that requires power without actually having the reins of political power itself, which was mind-boggling to—
I mean, that's where you inevitably go with this argument that Waxman is positing here, that anyone that has ever been negatively affected by a Jewish person has a legitimate right to be anti-Semitic, right? That's where you end up if you take it to its fullest.
Yeah, and the real problem, and again, I can't get in the mind of all Palestinians, of course, the real problem is and their allies. We know damn well what their allies think in the United States. That's why we formed the Jewish Studies Zionist Network. I hear it all the time. We heard speeches about Zionism being a global threat, et cetera, et cetera. People who are not Palestinians, their allies, have centered the Palestinian cause as the cause. It's the only foreign policy cause that they care about. They'll make arguments about, Biden funding Israel or whatever, but the other issue is presenting Zionism as a global threat and stuff like that, the tropes.
And I'll also add in that, people like Waxman, when they use phrases like "and their allies," fail to recognize that there's a lot of, compassion fatigue for the Palestinians among their longstanding allies.
As I've argued before, a lot of these allies don't give a shit about the Palestinians. This is more about their woke ideology, which contains an intrinsic anti-Semitic component.
Well, that's a big factor, I think, for Western supporters of Palestinians. But within the Middle East, a lot of their regional allies are just getting fed up with having to constantly show compassion for the Palestinians when they're not doing much to help themselves.
I would argue that even in 1948, they didn't show compassion for the Palestinians. It's not why they invaded Israel. It's not the Palestinians should have a state. It was no Jewish state anywhere in Palestine, right? They saw it as Arab land, belonging to whoever after the collapse of the empires that controlled it. It wasn't about the Palestinians. The other Arab states did not recognize a Palestinian nation until the 1960s, when it became convenient for them to do so. Mm-hmm. The Soviet Union played a major role in the creation of the PLO and other such groups. All right, I think we've exhausted Waxman.
I don't know if it's entirely fair to. I tend to think you're right, but I guess it's also possible that, people change their view and that they did develop a sympathy towards the Palestinian people, over the next few decades.
Where, here or over there?
Middle East.
It's hard to tell. There's so much propaganda. But I have heard Jew hatred expressed from people from other countries in the Middle East, and I can on a certain level, if I meet a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old from Syria, on a certain level, I can't really blame them because of the extent to which they were subjected to propaganda. Mm-hmm. People I know from the Soviet Union, older generation, have said some of the most outlandish things, not about Jews, but just about other stuff. Homosexuality, which is just like, wow, given the year that we're in and given your age, like, how do you actually believe this? And it's how they're brought up, right? There's to a certain, when you don't have access to a free media to counter your beliefs, there is that issue, right? So, on some levels, it's more about the regimes than the individuals themselves. Mm-hmm. But in practice, Professor Waxman, it doesn't really matter where the ideas emanate from. It doesn't matter if they emanate from the regime or from the people. because in practice, it will have the same consequences when said Arab encounters said Jew. So yeah, but I do think there's been shifting opinions among the leadership of the Arab states to Israel's benefits in recent years. All right, let's move on to our next one. So this is, I think, really nonsensical because he doesn't even address the anti-Semitism part, I don't think. Like, just because you legitimately believe you've been colonized does not mean you're automatically not anti-Semitic. It's not so straightforward.
Mhm.
All right, Dr. Mia Brett. Okay, she is a PhD in Jewish history. I believe her dissertation used CRT theory to explore anti-Semitism against the Jews in the late 19th and early 20th century. She's a legal scholar. It's a dissertation topic. I haven't read it, but I believe that it has merit since it shows presumably how anti-Semitism was ingrained in the United States, and the Jews were discriminated against, even though there was no legal discrimination against them. So if you're one of those people who believe in CRT and whatnot and everything and its attendant baggage, and you are a Jew, this would be something that's up your alley. Even if you are a Zionist, but she's not a Zionist by her own admission. She's tweeted plenty of times that she's not a Zionist, but she has woken up to the left being anti-Semitic. Now, this tweet,
I've never heard of her.
she tweets a lot. She has a very large Twitter following, 20,000 at least people. For a very junior scholar who just got like her, second job, I think, that's a lot of followers. Considering we're at about 540, it's a lot of followers. So she tweets a lot and she gets a lot of really angry responses all the time. So, and I imagine some of them are very offensive too. But this tweet, I'm disgusted at the racism in response to a call for a single state solution for Israel and Palestine, that Jews could never be safe in a Arab, country. Anti-Semitism and racism aren't not biologically essential characteristics. We can believe a peaceful single state is possible. Well, we can believe anything we want, of course, but okay, problems here.
Well, it's ridiculous on so many different levels. First of all, where in the world in an Arab country are Jews safe?
Well, where in the world of Arab countries are there Jews, for starters? Morocco and maybe some other, off the grid, in Tunisia, maybe some of the other minor states that are barely part of the whole Middle East conflict, right? There are no Jews there. What happened to them?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, to even take a step back, the argument that Jews are not safe in an Arab country is usually made or often made by people that go even further and say that Jews are not safe in any country other than a Jewish state, right? That there's going to be anti-Semitism rampant in any country, and that in fact is the reason or one of the main reasons why there needs to be an Israel in the first place. It's part of the motivation for Jewish nationalism, so that the Jews can safeguard their own future and their own destiny. Right? The history of Europe has shown that Jews have not been safe in Christian countries. So anyone that is saying that Jews are not safe in Arab countries are usually extending the argument that Jews aren't safe anywhere, right?
Oh, yes and no. I mean, I'm not going to pack up. I mean, I moved to the United States from Canada on the assumption that I'd be safer as a Jew. If I were offered a very comfy life in many West European states, where I had a lot of money and got to live well, I would probably take that opportunity. I wouldn't not go in fear.
Well,
I wouldn't move to any Arab state as a Jew.
People have fears, though, of living in non-Jewish societies, but often they're pointing to Europe, right? You can leave North America out of it, but it's usually Europe that is claimed as being a place where Jews are not safe. And in Eastern Europe, with exceptions like Hungary, Jews that live there very often don't even feel safe enough to come out as Jews, right?
Yeah, well, at least Eastern Europe. First of all, there's virtually no democracies in Eastern Europe. Second of all, they've had a history of of dictatorial rule and communist rule for a long portion of that. Most of them fell to fascism quite voluntarily in a handful of cases, like Slovakia and Hungary.
To get into a discussion of it, my main point here is that it's not just Arab countries that are singled out as being anti-Semitic, right, by Zionist supporters, right? It's much of the world, not just Arab countries. So that is one problem with
Okay,
this.
but that's post World War II in terms of the rest of the world. That's more of a theoretical problem, not so with the Arab states.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, we get back to the Arab states. Where are the Jews? Show me the Jews. Show me Babu, as Seinfeld, as Babu's brother said in Babu Bat. Where are the Jews?
Jews were expelled from all those places.
Yeah.
And also, you know, any discussion of a two-state solution, the Palestinian side seems very forthright in excluding Jews from their land. Look,
Yeah.
If the settlements are such a problem on the West Bank, why should they be a problem if the Arabs are going to welcome Jews in open arms and not be an unsafe place for the Jews to be there? It seems to me that if it's safe for Jews to be living in Arab countries, then we could give the Palestinians a state on the West Bank that would include the settlements and say goodbye to those Jews and say you're living in an Arab country now. Why are the settlements an impediment to a resolution to the conflict?
Absolutely. I mean, after all, there's 15% of the Israeli population that are Arabs. Why can't we have reciprocity here as far as that goes?
Exactly.
And again, this speaks to the fact that every last Arab country, with the exception of Morocco and maybe a couple of others, expunged their country of Jews, beginning with Syria's pogrom in Aleppo in 1949, and which I will say is a Jewish community that's 2,000 years old, going through Yemen, Iraq, Libya, all the states. They booted out their Syria. They all booted out their Jews. Egypt in the 1960s. And the Egyptian Jewish community was very well off, and they were integrated for a long time. It was decided once Zionism was, on the table, that the Jews everywhere were a fifth column, and they were a threat. They were closet Zionist supporters, and they were well off. They had done well with modernity, and even before that. So in many of the countries, not all of them, but so let's expunge them, expropriate them, and tell them to get the hell out. So violently, in many cases, as with Iraq. So why would any Jew operate on the assumption, leaving aside the fact that they'd be giving out this this difficultly achieved self-determination? Why would they give that up to take a chance of living in a state where the Arabs will ultimately form a demographic majority once they institute their right of return?
What really disgusts me about this tweet is that she calls this a racist position.
It's, well, the way she would, if we were to pin anyone down who holds this view, and actually Mira Sukharov has in fact commented on a claim I made about Arab states and governance once as racist. It's racist because in their minds we're singling out Arabs as being barbaric, who have this exterminatory tendency toward Jews. And I will extend it further because
in the 50s and 60s. The Jews were ethnically cleansed from Arab states, right? Yeah. So it's the fact.
Yeah. And I will extend this further and say that Jews, even if the Iraqi government welcomed them back, and you hear this sometimes, no, Palestinians should go back to Israel, and then Jews should have the right to go back where they came from. Yeah, who's going to pack their bag and run to Iraq? Not only because they're back in the diaspora, but they're living under a dysfunctional government. And the vast majority of Arab states, and you can get accused of racism for saying this, are either autocracies, or Islamic theocracies, or they're in a state of civil war, like Yemen, right? And I'm going back, if you go back to World War II, you throw Lebanon into the mix with their problems, Libya. I mean, look at all these countries, right? They're not safe to live in. And unless you want to follow the dictates of autocracy.
Consider what these countries have as their national policies towards Israel and Jews. We've seen since the Camp David Accords a major increase in Jewish tourism in Egypt because Jews now feel safer visiting Egypt. Since the Abraham Accords, we've seen a major
Visit,
increase
visit.
in Jews going to visit the UAE.
Well, Jews have been visiting Egypt, ever since the first. You're talking about Camp David 1, yeah.
Oh, Camp David 1, yeah.
Yeah, but again, you would still not want to live in Egypt, given what's happened there over the past 15 years. I mean, it's not a country of residence you're going to choose. And there are attacks on Christian Coptics there. So why would a Jewish community, reestablish themselves when there can be a revolution any day? And it could be an Islamic, an Islamic party can win an election, or maybe they'll take power. They'll be overthrown by the military. I mean, why would they give up a flourishing state to go and live there? And
here's what we should ask Mia Brett.
yeah,
would you move to Iraq? Would you move to Yemen? Yeah, let's ask her. Would you do that?
And the point is with Palestine, all the evidence of the 20th century suggests that a Palestinian state, or a state where both people live, that will be governed in part or mostly by Palestinians, will at best degenerate into civil war, and at worst turn into something far worse for the Jews, right? All the evidence points in that direction. The other Arab countries and the views held by the Palestinians of Jews, i.e. Zionism in practice. So, as Dov Waxman would put it. So this is not, and to answer that this is racism against Arabs, well, first of all, I would argue that a large percentage of the countries in the world outside of Europe are incredibly dysfunctional and would be dangerous for anyone to move there too. But more importantly, at what point have we said that this is some sort of racial issue? She throws in the word biology here, which we'll get back to in a sec. But let's say I'm not claiming that this is an Arab cultural issue. They seem to have a problem establishing democracies and the rule of law, absolutely. But I'm not saying it's something intrinsic to Arab or Muslim culture, right? For all I know, this could be a product of European colonialism. I could argue, and this is certainly true with Africa, that a lot of these states can't seem to govern themselves effectively with security for their citizens because they've been colonized by outsiders and sort of had modernity imposed on them.
I don't agree with you, but I suppose if you were to put it that way, that's a legitimate question to ask.
Oh yeah, it's a question. I don't think that's the case with the Middle East for the simple fact that the Europeans weren't there for very long. I mean, they were there.
Post this question on someone's wall.
I posted it on my wall. I said, is it racist to claim that Arabs in the last 100 years have demonstrated an inability to govern themselves, much as Russia has perpetually? No one calls me a racist when I say that about Russia, it seems, even though Russia goes back 500 years. But it's racism to single out the Arab world or to accuse the entire Arab world of not being able to govern themselves. And it's true, they haven't been able to. But I'm not accusing them of having something wrong with their culture. I'm not saying there's something intrinsic to Islam, to an inability to have well-ordered government. Something happened in modernity that led to this. I don't think that European imperialism can be blamed in the same way that you could blame it like in the Indian subcontinent or in Africa, where the Europeans were there for hundreds of years, right? There's a big difference here. Coming in after World War I and then leaving by World War II. That's not a very long period of time. You can't permanently damage a culture in 30 years like that.
I happen to believe that politics and economics revolve around culture. Culture is the explanatory factor for everything. So I would disagree with that assessment, but I suppose you could make that claim.
I agree. I'm not defending the colonialist argument here. I'm just saying that it's possible where I could say I don't think Arabs and Jews could live with each other at this point. And I could argue it without saying that it's something intrinsic to their culture. It's something intrinsic that happened in the 20th century, whether it's European colonialism, whether it's their belief that Jews have become colonizers, right? It is a belief. It's not a cultural belief in the sense that the Jews lived in the Arab Muslim world for centuries in peace, prospered in a way that they didn't in European states. And this was an Islamic culture, right? A pre-modern Islamic culture, mind you, but under those conditions, the Jews were very well treated within the nature of a pre-modern system, i.e. all people created free and equal is an idea that simply didn't exist at the time, right? I mean, there were hierarchies everywhere. So obviously it can't be something intrinsic to Islam, right? But that said, the Islamic states, especially the ones that are Arab, since the 20th century, have been sites where they have not been able to govern themselves. So I don't see how that's racist. I really don't see how it's racist. I'm just observing facts, from the past 75 to 100 years. Do you agree with me?
Uh,
Adam,
I mean, yeah, sure. If you're just looking at history over the last 75 years, sure. Why don't we move on to the last tweet?
yeah. But I'd like to point out as we move on, biologically essential characteristic. This is also a major leap of logic here. One can be, let's say, biased or bigoted against a culture, right? You could argue that, yeah, there's something wrong with Arab culture and they can't govern themselves. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying one can make that argument without bringing genetics into it. This has nothing to do with genetics. Who's saying that, there's something in.
Problem with the double negative here. Aren't not biologically essential characteristics?
I think the word not is there accidentally. I don't think that was
Oh.
deliberate. Yeah. Otherwise, the sentence makes no sense.
Mhm.
Yeah. And yeah, anyways, let's move on. J. Otto Pohl, a PhD in history, a complete whack job. Or even one of our friends, one of the few friends we have on the left, thinks the guy's nuts and the problem, and would be a Nazi under other circumstances. But he also seems to be a lefty in certain respects. Evidence of the Palestinians being biologically tougher than Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals. Not exactly a complete sentence for a PhD. Would Jews have survived as a distinct nation if confined to ghettos like Gaza for the last 75 years? There are 50 problems with this tweet, and there's not even 50 words in it.
Mhm.
What's the problems? You want to start?
Well, I don't understand. He's making a claim that Palestinians are biologically tougher than Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals, and that there's in fact evidence for this.
Where's the evidence for that?
What's the evidence?
Yeah, I mean, the Europeans wiped out almost the entire Native American population.
By
And
the way, what about the First Nations of Canada? Are they included in this too? Are Palestinians stronger than them?
yeah, J. Otto Pohl probably doesn't think much about Canada. I mean, it doesn't enter his mind.
What about the Maori of New Zealand?
I don't know anything about the Maori of New Zealand.
Okay, all right. I just
But
wanted
New Zealand is Canada's Australia, much as sorry, New Zealand is Australia's Canada to the United States.
right, yes. But my point here,
But yeah, the Native. Yeah, go on. What's your point?
my point here is that I don't know where this evidence comes from and what the evidence is showing.
Yeah, given that the Native Americans were wiped out, and since he decided to throw the word biologically in there, I should point out that a large percentage of them, I'm sure this is argued about by American historians, died from disease.
Well, wait a minute. Native Americans have not been wiped out. There are Native Americans. There still are.
There are
Native,
some. What, 90% of their population was wiped out?
I don't know what the percentage is. I'm sure it's quite a large number, large percentage. I don't know what it is, but they're not wiped out. They still exist.
They're virtually wiped out.
And there are Australian Aboriginals.
They're virtually wiped out in the same sense that Armenians from the Ottoman Empire were wiped out.
All right. So what he's saying then is that because the Palestinians have endured,
yes,
the Native Americans and the Australian Aboriginals have not.
Yeah.
In fact, their population numbers.
No. I think he's holding up sort of an agreement with you, I guess, that the resilience of the Native Americans for still being here, shows that they're biologically tough people. I think that's what his claim is here.
But he's saying that the Palestinians are tougher
because they endured worse circumstances than Native Americans in the United States,
and yet they still exist and they're not dying out. Like there's more. Their population has in fact increased.
I'm assuming there's more than now than there was 300 years ago, but don't quote me on that, please. So
that's what he's saying, then.
I guess so. So there's somehow biologically tough material, despite the fact that 90% of the population disappeared when the Europeans came.
So could it have anything to do with? So he's reducing it to biology.
Yeah, yeah, which is a problem. I want to come back to that in a sec. Let's
Right,
leave
so it's not that they're in fact not enduring anywhere near the kind of hardships that Native Americans or Australian Aboriginals had to.
I think all these, in his mind, Native Americans, Aboriginals, and Palestinians have endured the worst hardships out of anyone in the world, yet they survived. I think that's what his point is. I think it's a pretty straightforward point.
Okay.
And he thinks it's biological. Okay, now, again, I mean, she also used the word biologically here. Biology, and he's using it as if it's real. She's claiming it's not, which obviously it isn't.
Point.
What?
I don't know what you mean when you say this is a straightforward point. I'm still not wrapping my mind around it.
I think he's saying that much as the Nazis said that the Aryans were genetically superior, he's saying that the Palestinians and Native Americans and Australians are genetically or biologically superior because they've endured severe persecution.
No, he's saying that the Palestinians are tougher than the Native Americans or the Australian Aboriginals.
Okay, well, it could be either, but either way, the Palestinians are biologically superior people.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So forget the native. Yeah, it's absurd that. I mean, it could be interpreted either way. But he is suggesting biological superiority for the Palestinians. Now, I'm a historian, and I haven't read a history book that's used racial science as a legitimate form of analysis since one published leaving aside what the Nazis produced. Okay, literature produced under the Third Reich argued for biological superiority. That's what their historians wrote, and of course, it was common parlance among European intellectuals in the late 19th century. They believed in racial science, right? So does J. Otto Pohl. Now I'm looking into, I can't seem to find it. I'm hoping he's teaching a phrenology class next semester. I wouldn't mind enrolling that. I'd like measuring heads. I mean, that sounds like a good idea. I'd be interested in taking such a course.
No.
What?
Where does he teach?
I don't think he actually has a job.
But you said he's teaching a phrenology class.
No, I'm saying I wish he was. I said I'm looking into it. Yeah. No,
okay, because I can't imagine him teaching anywhere and his students and his colleagues and his administration see these kinds of tweets and don't knock on his door and demand to know what it is that he's saying.
Well, the issue is the word biological in there. The rest of it, he'd get away with it. I've seen professors tweet far worse than that. So yeah, but putting the biologically element in there harks back to the late 19th century. He believes in racial science, and I'd like to see his take on phrenology. But here, the second sentence: would Jews have survived as a distinct nation if confined to ghettos like Gaza for the last 75 years? And then what's the problem with that sentence? Let's assume Gaza's hell on earth for a second. Whoever's responsible for it.
Well, haven't Jews lived in these kinds of ghetto kind of circumstances?
Yeah, for 1,500 years. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a little bit absurd because, there weren't any real ghettos with walls in Europe until the 1500s. There was no such thing as the medieval ghetto. But in terms of cultural and social and political, they were essentially ghettoized before the Renaissance era. They were ghettoized. Sometimes they were confined to certain areas of town. They very often had to wear distinct clothing. They were not allowed to work by the late Middle Ages in any profession except for money lending, and they got expelled and they had to move. We're not going to go through the whole history here. And then again, in World War II, the ghettos come back. So you don't really know your Jewish history here. And I think the bigger irony is survived as a distinct nation, since whatever you want to call the Jews, whether a nation, an ethnicity, a race, or a religion, the categories were meaningless. I can't think of any other collective of people, genealogically defined collective of people that survived for 2,000 years without a state. Can you name another group?
We're literally talking about the oldest nation that's still around, right?
Yeah. Whatever you want to call them. And not only that,
and how we've managed to survive all this time, our humor, our sense of humor, like Tim Watley says.
Yeah, it's our humor that's kept us around for, as Jerry thinks, 5,000 years. So I mean, this is utterly absurd. It's the most ridiculous thing that I've ever read in my life. And the fact of the matter is, this guy has a PhD in history. Okay, so maybe we should look for his plagiarism in his dissertation next, because I doubt he's citing any of the leading phrenologists from the 19th century, and he probably should be.
Well, I mean, he's just seemingly making this up, right? So maybe it's not plagiarized. I mean, sometimes you have to be completely original to say the most ridiculous, absurd things.
And there he did it. Okay, so I think that covers everything here. This was a pretty succinct one to do.
Also, by the way, like Gaza for the last 75 years, the Gaza hasn't been there for at least as Palestinian Gaza hasn't been there for 75 years.
Well, since 1948. I mean, it was just controlled by Egypt.
Right, but there were Jews that like you didn't have a blockade around it like that went back not 75 years, it went back to the mid 2000s. So what's he saying?
Absolutely. And I read an article, I don't know if you sent it to me, by an Israeli who grew up in a kibbutz very early on, post 1948, but before the 6 Day War, and even I think maybe after the 6 Day War, he was able to. He said he freely went back and forth with Gaza, interacted with people. They had a vibrant life. They sat their problems aside. They talked. So I mean, I don't think life became hell in Gaza. I can't say that for certain because I don't know all about how the Egyptians treated them. Obviously, the Egyptians didn't treat them well because they never offered them citizenship. But yeah, no, and even if you look at, I mean, same thing with the West Bank. Everyone who studies it in the 1970s know that, before the first Intifada, you didn't have walls, you didn't have checkpoints. Life might have not been great compared to Israelis, but, compared to the other Middle Eastern countries, it's not, it all depends on what your yardstick is for comparing your definition of suffering and mobility, right? So this is absurd on that level too.
Well, I think we've exhausted the topic. I will just add that, for all of this guy's nuttiness, I like his name, J. Otto Pol. That's a good name.
It is a good name.
And Otto, it's a palindrome. It's the same backwards as it is forwards. And
Auto, like auto parts. I don't know what movie that's from, but it's from one of those 1980s movies.
Yeah.
Check. So yeah, so that's that wraps up our 3 tweets of the week. There's much to chew on. Waxman is incoherent for someone who has one of the best Jewish studies jobs in the country. Mia Brett is also oblivious to history and seems to be finding biological racism where it doesn't actually exist, i.e. people hurling accusations of biological racism. I should be fair because I don't know everyone who replied to her tweets, and it is possible some people came back and said the Arabs are genetically predisposed to blah 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 blah. So I can't claim that, but there are plenty of rational people who will say that Jews are not safe in an Arab country, like me. And we finished up with what is easily the most absurd tweet that I've read recently, aside from a handful from Sasha, but we won't go there. All right, so let me turn off screen share so people can all.
And this one from Otto Pol, some of the anti-Zionists on the left would agree with our assessment that this is ridiculous.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's no, it doesn't make any, well, the word biologically is in there. I mean, the left doesn't believe in biological racism. That's what makes them different from Nazis. They don't believe in biological racism, right? They've racialized everything, but no, they don't believe. Genetic racism seems to be largely gone from public discourse, notwithstanding the persistence and perhaps worsening of racism against certain groups in the United States. Nobody talks about genetics. Even when it comes to the Jews, it's all about obtaining political power through conspiracies. The biological degeneracy was one of those things delegitimized by the aftermath of Nazism, and that actually seems to have taken hold. So, except for J. Otto Pol and his phrenology course, but otherwise, yeah, that's gone. Well, I guess we should end things off here. Our next podcast will be featuring a very special guest. What's her name?
Dr. Tabia Lee. She was a director of a DEI. I forgot what university it was. It was back in the West, I think in California. And she was arguing that DEI is anti-Semitic, inherently anti-Semitic, and she is opposed to a lot of what DEI is about. And she has been in the news quite a bit and has agreed to be on our podcast. So
Yeah,
that'll
that's terrific. Yeah, she's one of the more high-profile people we've been able to get on our podcast. Yeah, yeah. There was one guy, I won't say what school he's from, but he said, "You guys don't have enough of a viewership for me to, waste 45 minutes on you."
uh-huh.
Such is life. Okay, well, we are signing off here, and I think we did justice to all three people and what they are claiming they're saying, and that's it. So
Yeah.
this is Jarrod, and this is Adam, and we are signing off.
Goodbye.